Okay, we are recording. You're ready to go.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. Welcome, everyone. If we haven't met before, my name is Madeline Potter. I'm the faculty specialist for entomology and integrated pest management with the University of Maryland Extension Home and Garden Information Center. So thank you for joining us this afternoon on your lunch hour as we learn about the invasive crepe myrtle bark scale. I'll begin by putting up our university's assurance statement, as well as our Injustice for All poster, reminding you that if you find any of our programs are not accessible to you in any way, that you can reach out to us or the contacts listed on this poster. So please let us know if you have any questions about this. So before we get into the content about crepe myrtle bark scale, I wanted to let you all know about some other upcoming webinars that I will be hosting this month in the month of May. So next Wednesday, there will be another noon to 1:30 webinar called Pollinator Power, Tools, Resources, and Outreach Strategies for National Pollinator Week that we have coming up in June. And then the following Wednesday on May 21st, I'm hosting another one called Buzzworthy Beescaping, Empowering Others to Cultivate Native Bee Habitats. So if you're interested, please look into registering for either one of those, or they will also be recorded and posted to our HGIC YouTube for you to watch at a later time.
Sorry, Marty, I forgot to launch the demographics poll right when we started, so just giving folks a heads up, I'm going to go ahead and launch it now, but once you answer it, folks, it'll go away for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Steph. So I'll give you a little bit of time to fill out the demographic poll. This really helps us collect valuable data to know who we are reaching with these webinars and continuing education, so we can improve upon reaching more of our audiences, our diverse audiences throughout Maryland. So thank you for taking the time to fill that out. Once you are finished with that poll, no rush. I just have a question on the screen, or two questions on the screen for you. Have you seen crepe myrtle bark scale in person before? And if so, in what Maryland county? So if you are willing to, you can place your comments in the chat box below if you've seen crepe myrtle bark scale, and if so, where? Again, no rush if you are still filling out that demographic poll. I know I've been seeing it in Prince George's County in my neighborhood. I've been seeing it down in Washington, D.C. I've heard from some folks, our master gardeners out on the Eastern Shore in Queen Anne's County. They've been seeing it in their neighborhoods. So it's definitely spreading throughout Maryland in many of our counties. Looks like we've been seeing it in Montgomery County, Anne Arundel County, Somerset. And as we'll learn a little bit later, we don't have a great idea on this particular insect's distribution. So it is really helpful to know where we are seeing it and hearing from you all. So thank you for that. Frederick, Baltimore County, Montgomery County, Anne Arundel. Awesome. Thank you for chiming in. That's really helpful. So as we're getting started today, I like to do a little check-in for what brought you here, whether you are a master gardener volunteer yourself or a general public member who wants to learn more about this particular insect, just kind of checking in for what do you hope to get out of today's session? What skills or resources do you hope to gain? I like to bring this up because if at any point, or especially toward the end of our presentation, you feel that something is missing or that there's more you want to learn more about, please keep that in mind and let me know at some point, whether that be in the chat box at some point today, or you can shoot me an email. I'll have my email up at the end of the presentation. So we are helping the public understand crepe myrtle bark scale. That is my role. That is the role of fellow educators, if you're an educator yourself or a volunteer educator, along with sustainable management of this pest. So if we're a master gardener or if we're a general public member, all of us can be science communicators and educators, right? We're speaking to family and friends, we're speaking to our neighbors. There are lots of opportunities to educate others about what we're learning and what we're learning about today. So I'm framing today's topics in the form of skills that we're hoping to build upon through today's topics, such as debunking myths. So combating common misconceptions about crepe myrtle bark scale using science-based information. Next, we're going to identify and educate, teach the public how to recognize crepe myrtle bark scale and distinguish it from other issues. Present sustainable pest management options, so provide science-based control methods around the concept of integrated pest management. Connect crepe myrtle bark scale to the bigger picture. So explain how biodiversity, native plants, and beneficial insects help to reduce pest outbreaks. And then last but not least, we'll have a short reflection and activity about how we can engage in outreach and extension. Again, whether that be through being a master gardener or speaking with fellow neighbors, family, and friends. And so some prompts, some brainstorming topics for developing materials and strategies to inform our communities about pests like crepe myrtle bark scale, but this can extend to any pest that we are dealing with, including the invasive spotted lanternfly. So an outline of today's topics, an outline of skills that I hope we are able to build on today. So let's start with debunking common myths. So I have 4 different myths on the screen here. We're going to walk through all of them today. And when I put up the myth on the screen, I want for you to take a guess. Do you think it's a myth? Or I just gave it away. So what I was going to have us do is when I put up on the screen, do you think it's a myth or a fact? So play along with me here. I unfortunately gave it away. I should have known better, having a little bit of a morning, but we're going to walk through some of these. So you can see on the screen here, crepe myrtle bark scale is a disease, not an insect. So as we're learning about these, as I gave away, these are all myths that we're talking about this morning, just things to be aware of, things that we may have thought was a myth or a fact before coming to our webinar this afternoon, or some things to be aware about that our family, friends, neighbors, and communities may think is fact. So on the screen we have here, crepe myrtle bark scale is a disease, not an insect. So I would typically ask, is this a myth or a fact? So this is a myth. So crepe myrtle bark scale is not a disease, it is an insect. It's a small insect that feeds on plant sap, and we're going to learn more about this insect a bit later. Next, crepe myrtle bark scale is only found on crepe myrtles. Do we think this is a myth or a fact? So this is a myth. Crepe myrtle bark scale has also been found on other plant species, including our Native American beautyberry, also something we'll go into more detail a bit later. Crepe myrtle bark scale is always easy to spot. Is this a myth or a fact? So this is a myth. At low numbers, crepe myrtle bark scale can go unnoticed like a lot of our other scale species. We have lots of scale species in Maryland and throughout the United States. And when they're at low numbers, they're just starting off on a plant before they reproduce and get into bigger populations. They can hide in bark crevices, they may be hiding under leaves, so they can be a little harder to spot unless we're really up close with the plant and we're knowing what we're looking for. So we're going to learn a little bit more on identifying crepe myrtle bark scale, what it can look like, some of the symptoms we can also be looking for along with the pest itself, so we can spot it a little bit easier. And last but not least, we have crepe myrtle bark scale is harmless to plants. Is this a myth or a fact? This is a myth. So crapemyrtle bark scale, like many of our other scale insect pests, can reduce plant health, potentially leading to delayed or lack of blooms, leaf yellowing and or drop, and branch dieback. In really severe cases, if the pest, if we don't have any sort of management tactics for the pest and it gets to really extreme high population levels, we could eventually have plant death. It's going to depend on lots of different factors, including the overall health of the plant itself, along with the damage that the pest may be causing. So, things to be aware of. Now, as we're learning about these different common myths related to this particular pest, crepe myrtle bark scale, I like to put up some tips when it comes to navigating in our world of a lot of different misinformation that's out there, right? Especially in the age of artificial intelligence, AI, a lot of people are looking for advice on pest insects by Googling it or using other search engines. Now, with say Google, for instance, it has an automatic AI response from what's called Gemini at the top of the screen. And this isn't always accurate. Sometimes it is pulling from non-science based, non-research based information. And so we can help our fellow family, friends, neighbors, communities to navigate this world of all this information that we're trying to look through and to use those credible resources. And so when we're combating misconceptions and misinformation, when we're talking with others and people, we have a couple of suggestions and advice when we're doing this. And so the first is to listen and lead with questions. The second is to acknowledge concerns before addressing the myth. And the third is to provide simple, actionable takeaways. When we're listening and leading with questions, so we're learning more, maybe we're working with a general public member that's asking questions about what's going on with their crepe myrtle. They want to know what this pest is. We can encourage critical thinking by asking questions like, what makes you think that? Where did you find that information, especially if they're coming up with a potential myth or something that isn't science-based. And we're going to show curiosity and respect and create an open conversation, right? We're not shaming anyone for believing something. We're all navigating in this world of lots of information coming at us, and it can be really overwhelming. When we're acknowledging concerns before addressing the myth and providing that science-based information, we want to validate people's concerns, especially when we have emerging pests. It can cause a lot of emotions and really strong reactions. We've seen this a lot with spotted lanternfly, for instance. So any sort of new or incoming pest can stir up a lot of fear and worry, especially when someone really cares about the plants in their landscape, right? We're all plant level lovers, and we want to provide a really great sustainable landscapes. So we want to validate people's concerns, saying things like, I can see why you're concerned about that, and kind of meet people where they are. And when we're providing simple, actionable takeaways, we want to offer a short, memorable fact, especially to begin with, because maybe not everyone wants to hear, say, the whole life cycle of crepe myrtle bark scale or the origin of where it originally evolved and how it came over here into the United States. So someone might not want to know all of that information. Maybe we just need to provide them with that quick, memorable fact that addresses their concerns and their needs when it comes to their own crepe myrtle or plant within their landscape, and suggesting a practical action or alternative perspective. So for example, we could say something like, instead of spraying, say, a pesticide right away, we could try other management tactics first to protect the pollinators in your garden. So this is potentially connecting to something that someone's interested in. Maybe they vocalize to you that they have plants in their landscape to support pollinators. So we can connect that with why we may want to utilize a more sustainable pest management tactic like non-pesticide alternatives. So just some quick tips when it comes to combating misconceptions. This goes beyond misconceptions with crepe myrtle bark scale, but any sort of insect, especially insect pest. Next, we're going to learn how we can identify crepe myrtle bark scale and distinguish it from other potential issues that, say, our crepe myrtles could be facing in our landscapes. So we're going to review crepe myrtle bark scale's distribution, biology, and damage symptoms. So crepe myrtle bark scale is an insect and it belongs in this insect group that we label as Hemiptera, also commonly known as true bugs. And all true bugs have a straw-like or piercing sucking mouth part. This particular true bug, crepe myrtle bark scale, has been in the United States since 2004, and it's been in Maryland since 2020. We have a picture on our far right showing a crepe myrtle branch that is covered with crepe myrtle bark scale. So each of those individual white, circular, oval shapes that we can see on the bark is an individual scale insect. So far, crepe myrtle bark scale is in over 16 states in the United States, including Maryland. It was first detected in Maryland in Baltimore County, and it has since spread to several of our counties, as we can see from our chat box with people chiming in from what they're seeing. And we currently don't have a great or accurate distribution map at this time because of the lack of reporting. And so reporting comes from not only other, say, entomologists or scientists or educators, but the general public. So there hasn't been a lot of, say, campaigning or PR like with spotted lanternfly to report this pest. So we don't have a lot of really great information on exactly where we are finding it. A little more about crepe myrtle bark scale's biology. As I said, this particular insect belongs to an insect group known as true bugs. So they have that straw-like mouth part. We can see a classification table on the screen. So on the far left, our darker green column, we can see all these classification names. And so starting from the very top, this is the broad classification. So class, so belonging to our group of insects, and then going all the way down, narrowing to more specific classifications to species. And that's where we land at the species crepe myrtle bark scale. And this just shows you other insects that crepe myrtle bark scale is related to. So things like aphids, whiteflies, mealybugs, going down more narrowly to scales and mealybugs. And specifically, this particular scale species is a felt scale. So we have also hard scales and soft scales. So what are scale insects? If we are new to learning about this particular type of insect, I'm just going to provide a little information, overview, potentially review of what scale insects are. And so these are soft-bodied insects that cover themselves with layers of flexible or stiff wax. So it's like a protective shell or coating over their soft body. They have piercing sucking mouth parts that feed from plant cells, so sucking up plant juice as their nutrition, almost like a plant smoothie. The adult female scale will settle and they're sessile as they're an adult. So once they reach that adult stage, they do not move. So they settle on one part on the plant, they stick down that straw-like mouth part down into the plant, and she will stay there the rest of her life, feeding, drinking that plant juice until she dies off. Immature scales, so the immature stages, are mobile and are known as crawlers. So this is the case for lots of our different scale species. So at this stage, they're really tiny. We're going to see a short video of what this looks like, and they're moving around the plant before they begin to settle. They'll grow bigger as they molt, and then if it's a female, she will stay there with that wax-like covering the rest of her life, feeding on the plant until she dies off. On the far right, we have an example scale species. This is called Indian scale, so different species from crepe myrtle bark scale. We can see that white waxy covering over the top. It almost looks like a turtle shell, right? If we were to flip this covering over, we'll see on the bottom right, that little pink area is the body of the scale insect. So this is some way that we can tell if we have live scale on our plant, is doing what's called the flip test, where we can flip one of the coverings over and see if we see a pink body. If it's all dried out, that means the scale is dead. Now, when we do this, we do kill the scale because that straw-like mouthpart's down the plant, rips it off, we were to flip it over. So little flip test to tell if we have live scale on our plant. Here are just a few other examples of different scale species that can be commonly found, like our Indian wax scale we saw earlier. We have elongate hemlock scale. We can see those kind of oval-shaped scale on the individual hemlock leaves. And then our crepe myrtle bark scale that we're learning about today. For more of a visual of how these straw-like mouthparts work for our scale species, we have a drawing or a diagram here, which is a cross-section of wood showing different scale insects feeding. So we have two different scale insect examples here. On the left, we have a soft scale insect. Put my cursor here. And on our right, we have what's called an armored scale insect on our right. And what you'll see highlighted in yellow is that straw-like mouthpart going through the different layers of our cross-section of wood. So it could be a woody plant, for instance. So we can see with our soft scale species, they're tapping down into the phloem layers, and our armored scale are tapping all the way down into the cambium layers. Now, our crepe myrtle bark scale is neither a soft scale or an armored scale. It's considered the third type, which is a felt scale. And crepe myrtle bark scale is feeding on sap from both the phloem and the xylem layers, as we can see with our diagram here. Phloem and our xylem. So really interesting, pretty cool to think that they have this straw-like mouthpart that is piercing all the way down through these woody layers. Now we also have scale insects that will feed from herbaceous tissue. So it could be an herbaceous stem or leaves. And so they would be piercing down into the leaf layers or the herbaceous layers. Crepe myrtle bark scale is a non-native insect, so it's originally from Eastern Asia. The number of generations varies quite a bit. We're still learning more about this species, especially on the number of generations it has here in Maryland, but it can have anywhere between 2 to 4 generations per year, possibly overlapping. And this, of course, can change with global warming and climate change. As it begins to warm up, we could potentially have more generations of insects, like things like crepe myrtle bark scale. Some of the host plants in our next slide, we'll delve into this a bit more, but it has a pretty wide host range, especially when we're looking at the host plants it feeds on in, say, China, one of the countries it is from. So over 15 different host plant families, but its primary host plant, especially what we're seeing here in the United States and in Maryland, is crepe myrtle. So here on the screen, we have a list of different host plants. Especially, I'm highlighting some reported native host plants that has been found feeding on in the US so far. So it has been found feeding on one of our natives known as American beautyberry, but its primary host plant, where we're seeing it the most, are different crepe myrtle species. There are some gray plants on the screen we can see that are deemed as not native to Maryland. So other native plants to, say, the western side of the US and California, some potential agricultural plants it's been found feeding on, as well as some invasive plant species. Then on the right side of our screen, we see a photo on the top of an infested American beautyberry with crepe myrtle bark scale, and then one of our uninfested as a reference on the bottom. There's a general life cycle of crepe myrtle bark scale, similar to lots of our other scale species. And so we can start on the left with our eggs. And so they are laid underneath a female covering or wax covering. So right with her body, she'll lay what's called an ovisac, so a sac of eggs, anywhere between 114 to 320 eggs, quite a lot, and they're really tiny. Once those hatch underneath the covering, they will emerge as nymphs. So this immature stage that we call crawlers, because this is the mobile stage of our scale species. Also very tiny. They'll range from 0.3 to 1 millimeters long. We'll typically need some sort of magnification or hand lens to be able to spot them. Now, if we have a female scale, she will continue on to molt and develop that scale or that waxy covering over her body. This is a protective covering. And then she'll become sessile, right? She'll stay in one place on the plant, continue to feed, and eventually die off once she reaches that particular point in her life. Now, the male scale will form a pupal casing or covering and begin to pupate and then become a winged adult. Very small winged insects that don't have any mouth parts, so does not feed, does not live for very long because it is seeking out other female scales to mate with, and then for her to be able to produce those fertile eggs. So they're just flying around looking for a mate, not causing any damage themselves, but it's the females, the sessile adult females, that are feeding on the plant. So if we're familiar with different types of metamorphosis or life cycles, our females have what's called as incomplete. So the females do not go through a pupal stage, for instance, versus the males do to become that winged adult. So here are some close-up photos of the crawlers on our left. So the mobile stage is zoomed in pretty far because they are very tiny. And then we have some examples of white male coverings on our right before they pupate and become that winged adult. Here we have a short video clip. This is a different scale species, but just to give you a visual of what scale crawlers look like. So this is the immature nymphal stage of our scale. We can see them emerging from this ovisac, so this collection of eggs that have hatched these immature scale as they emerge. So crapemyrtle bark scale nymphs and crawlers are going to look very similar when we're looking on our own plants. This is a photo we saw earlier. So a branch of crepe myrtle, we can see all the individual scale coverings. So we likely have a mixture here of both female and male coverings of all different shapes and sizes. It can vary depending on the life stage the scale is at, as well as where they begin to settle on the plant itself. But the scale coverings are typically anywhere from 1 to 2 millimeters long. Some other images for visuals of what different branches. So these are thinner branches with the crepe myrtle bark scale coverings on them. This is a heavy infestation, as we can see, where we have lots of scale collecting together on a branch. It forms a uniform white appearance or covering, especially if we're looking from far away. Once we get up close, we can notice and realize that we have individual scales all piled together on this particular crepe myrtle. This is a pretty heavy infestation we are seeing here. Now, the damage that crepe myrtle bark scale can cause can range quite a bit and really depends on the number of scale we have on a particular plant. So early on with scale, crepe myrtle bark scale, and other scale species, as well as other true bugs that have this piercing sucking mouth part, a lot of them are feeding on plant sap, typically from the phloem layer, which is a very sugary plant sap substance. And what they excrete as a byproduct on feeding from this plant sap is what is called honeydew. So very sugary itself, rains down on whatever is underneath the feeding insect. So that could be on the plant itself, could be down on the sidewalk, could even be under landing on furniture or even cars, unfortunately. And this honeydew is very sticky and sugary. What can grow on the honeydew is what is called sooty mold, which is a type of fungus. Now, when it lands on the plant itself, it doesn't directly infect the plant with some sort of disease, but what it can result in is covering the surface, say the leaves potentially, and blocking sunlight and photosynthesis. So that could impair the photosynthetic abilities of plants, which is not good. And so sooty mold, we'll see in the next slide with different photos, is a dark appearance, blocking that sunlight. So at low to moderate infestations, we're seeing honeydew, we're seeing potentially sooty mold growth. Another pest that also we're seeing this with is spotted lanternfly. Now, as we get higher up into the populations of crepe myrtle bark scale, we could have leaf yellowing and drop. We could have delayed or no blooming, so no flowering. We could have branch dieback, and we could eventually have plant death in very severe cases. So here we have some photos and examples of what sooty mold growth can look like on the bark or the branches of our crepe myrtles. So on our left, we can see that really dark coloring on the trunk and the stems of crepe myrtle. So that's sooty mold that we have growing. And another example on our right. If we look closely, we can see some of those scale white coverings sticking out amongst the sooty mold. Now, what we have found, especially in the United States so far, is that crepe myrtle bark scale is mainly feeding and infesting the woody parts of our crepe myrtles, so the trunks and the stems. It is rare to see it on the leaves, but we have seen it before. So we can monitor for crepe myrtle bark scale on the leaves as well. But we're especially seeing is that honeydew potentially landing on the leaves, as well as then the sooty mold growth, like we're seeing in the image on the screen now. And we can see some of the waxy filament that's coming from the scale covering that they produce also on this leaf. Now, some other potential pests and pathogens beside crepe myrtle bark scale that could be affecting our crepe myrtles include things like lichens. Now, these are harmless. We see this on lots of different woody plants, but can look like an unusual growth on the woody parts of our plants. So something to distinguish from when we're looking at different pest and pathogen problems. On our right, we have example photos of powdery mildew, which is a fungus that can infest some of our plants. Pretty broad range, so it's not only affecting our crepe myrtles, for instance, but many of our other plants. We've likely seen it before, especially if we don't have some great airflow between our plants. It can be really humid and result in this powdery mildew growth. And we can see it's powdery like the name suggests, so if we were to feel it, pretty powdery on the plant tissue itself. Now here's a breakdown if we want some more information in terms of differentiating powdery mildew, our fungus, between our insect crepe myrtle bark scale. So this can be helpful if we're working with someone in the general public who isn't familiar with powdery mildew or say scale insects, to give them some more information to go off of when they're looking at and monitoring their own crepe myrtle plants. So I won't go through this in a lot of detail. You're welcome to reference it back in today's recording. I'm happy to also share out this slide as a PDF version. But for example, the texture of our powdery mildew is going to be fine, dusty, or fluffy fungal growth, versus our scale insects are going to be hard, scaly, and bumpy coating. Also, our powdery mildew is primarily going to be affecting the leaves, the young stems, the shoot tips, and the flower buds, versus our scale insects are primarily found on trunks and branches, rarely on the leaves, and typically not present on new growth unless there are really heavy infestations. So just some comparisons there. And then a little side by side, we have photos of what powdery mildew looks like on crepe myrtle on our left, and then our example photos of different crepe myrtle bark scale signs and symptoms on our right. There is another insect pest that is specific to our crepe myrtles, and it is crepe myrtle aphid. So we don't get super creative with the names, pretty straightforward. Crepe myrtle aphid, it's an aphid, so another type of insect found on our crepe myrtles. It is a non-native species. It belongs to the same group of insects as true bugs like our scale species, so they still have that straw-like or piercing sucking mouth parts. And thus, they're feeding on that plant sap. And what do our plant sap feeders excrete? They excrete honeydew, so that sugary substance. So we could have honeydew and sooty mold, just like with our crepe myrtle scale insects. Now these appear different when we're monitoring and looking for them. So if we're just seeing the honeydew and or the sooty mold, we want to take a closer look. So that could be a symptom alerting us that we have some sort of pest on our plant, say our crepe myrtle. Once we get a closer look, maybe we're looking for the scale insect itself, looking for what that looks like as we've learned, or we could potentially be looking for the aphids. Maybe we have both on our plant. So these are some photos of what the aphids can look like. They're going to be hanging out on the undersides of the crepe myrtle leaves. When we look closer, we can see some zoomed in photos on our bottom left. Aphids can either be winged or wingless, typically pear-shaped. They are still smaller insects. And on our top right, we see a zoomed in photo of a winged aphid. And some symptoms from the feeding of aphids is we'll have yellowing damage on the leaves. So discoloration of the leaves itself as they're feeding from the leaf tissue. When they're extracting that plant sap, they're also extracting chlorophyll with it. So we get that yellowing of our green leaves. So another pest to be on the lookout for. So we've debunked some myths. We've learned to identify our crepe myrtle bark scale as well as to distinguish it from other pest and pathogen problems with crepe myrtles. Now we're going to learn about different sustainable management options. So here we have an overview of things we can do year round, such as monitoring and reporting where we're seeing crepe myrtle bark scale, avoiding high nitrogen fertilizers, and conserving our predators. And on our right, we have an overview of things we can do by season or the different life stages of crepe myrtle bark scale. So for instance, we can monitor for those immature crawlers starting in the middle of this month, so mid-May. And we can apply horticultural oil when crawlers are active and or in the winter to our overwintering scale species. So we're going to learn a little bit more about this with our different options. When it comes to monitoring for crepe myrtle bark scale crawlers, we can observe the plant itself at all different times of year because we could have, say, overwintering scale in the wintertime. We could have emerging crawlers around this time in the month and then throughout the summer through September. So we can always be out there looking for them. Some indicator that we can use is what is known as growing degree days. If this is a new term for us, we have a really great page on our UMD extension website. If you type in growing degree days, UMD extension, we have an explanation of what this indicator is, as well as a calculator that you can use. So you can type in your zip code, calculate your growing degree days, and then compare it to different growing degree days that we have found based off of research for when different insects are, say, emerging or hatching. So based on the research, we found that at 638 degree days, we have egg hatch of crepe myrtle bark scale, so our first generation. We've also had previous reports of first crawlers in areas like College Park on May 31st, or say in Ellicott City on May 29th. So your growing degree day is going to vary based on where you are in Maryland, or if you're, say, outside of the state of Maryland. So I highly recommend checking out that calculator. And we also have a pest predictive calendar that will have this list of the different degree days that correlate with a pest emergence or, say, hatching. So depending on the species. Another way we can monitor for crepe myrtle bark scale and other scale species, and we're looking for those really tiny crawlers, is using the double-sided sticky tape method. What you're going to do is if you have scale present or you think scale is present on a plant, we can pick out at least 2 to 3 branches on our plant and then wrap it with, say, electrical tape to start with. So we have a dark background to contrast our lighter colored crawler insects. And then on top of that electrical tape, we place double-sided sticky tape. checking this at least once a week. We can start around this time of year if we want to try this method out, since we're having or predicting our crawlers to emerge soon, as we likely will need to change out this tape at least once a week. As you can imagine, lots of things can stick to it, so something to be mindful of as well. We don't want to always have something sticky on our plant because we could be sticking some of our beneficial insects as well. So only something we're approaching when we think we're going to have crawlers, and if we know we want to take action once we have crawlers present, say by applying a horticultural oil. Now, once we have something on that sticky tape, we'll likely need a hand lens or some sort of magnification to be able to spot and see if we do indeed have crawlers, those scale crawlers on our tape, because it could be some other insect. Now, if we're interested in reporting crepe myrtle bark scale and where we are seeing it, there is a group of scientists and researchers that have developed a website called stopcmbs.com/report. So CMBS for crepe myrtle bark scale. So stopcrapemyrtlebarkscale.com. On there, you can report where you are seeing it, and it can help to update our distribution maps. As we delve into some of our more sustainable control tactics, I am basing them off of our integrated pest management control tactics pyramid. So if we've never seen this before, how this pyramid works is we have our different control categories such as cultural, physical, biological, and chemical. And we show them in a pyramid because we want to start at the bottom of our pyramid. So the first control tactics that we want to use are cultural. And then last resort control tactics are going to be chemical. So we can see on our far right with our arrow, we have increasing environmental risk as we move up the triangle, as we move up towards a chemical control tactic. So having increasing risk and potential risk for our environment and other non-target animals and wildlife. So first we'll talk about some control tactics in our cultural category. So starting at the very bottom of our triangle. So these are practices related to plant health care, landscape design, and sanitation. So things related to our crepe myrtles and its overall health. We can avoid high nitrogen fertilizers, as we've seen by different research studies, not only for crepe myrtle bark scale, but other insect species, is that if we over fertilize our plants, especially with nitrogen, it can lead to a boosted population of pests, believe it or not. So something to be aware of. We can increase plant diversity around our crepe myrtles. We've learned time and time again that plant diversity supports a diversity of different insects, including our key predators and parasitic insects that will help to lower pest populations. So when we're talking about sustainable landscapes, we're talking about native plant diversity. We can reduce broad spectrum pesticide use. This will also help to support our beneficial insects, the ones that help us with sustainable pest control, as well as our pollinators. We can look into disease-resistant crepe myrtle varieties to support the overall health of our crepe myrtles. We can avoid mulch volcanoes. I'm going to talk about this a bit more in a minute. We can water appropriately, and we can also prune appropriately. As we probably saw in the wintertime, we see a lot of what we deem as crepe murder or topping. So hacking, especially around the tops and the branches of our crepe myrtles, this could potentially impact the health of the plant. And so we do have an overall page for crepe myrtles and their care, as well as common pests and pathogens on our UMD Extension website. That's linked on the bottom left right here. We have the URL as well as a QR code. So mulch volcanoes, if you talk to anyone that works in home horticulture and extension at UMD, this is one of our pet peeves. When we're driving around, we're walking in our neighborhoods, we see this quite a bit, and you've likely seen this yourself. And so our mulch volcano is what's shown on our left, and this can severely impact the health of our trees. So mulch volcanoes can hold moisture against the bark, inviting rot, pests, rodents, and potentially disease. We do not want our mulch touching the trunk of our trees. So unfortunately, this has become a common landscaping practice, and you'll likely see this especially in any sort of managed landscape. So what we do want is shown on our right for proper mulching, especially around our trees, approximately only 1 to 3 inches deep with our mulch, and we want it 3 inches away from the tree trunk base. It should never be touching the trunk of our tree. So if we want to learn more about proper mulching for our trees and our shrubs, I also have a page linked on our bottom left for that as well. Moving up to our next category of our triangle, we're going to talk about physical and mechanical tactics we can take. So practices related to removing, excluding, or trapping pests. So we could prune out heavily infested branches with proper pruning techniques. We could try strong water sprays combined with a soft scrub brush to manually dislodge some of the scales and their coverings. There are mixed results in terms of how this physical management tactic works. Some will recommend this for other scale species as well. It's not going to solve all of our problems with scale species, and it's going to really depend. If you've had experience with this, I'd love to hear how it goes. I haven't found a lot of kind of clear results on this, especially for crapemyrtle bark scale, so I'd love to hear more if you do try this out. Next up our triangle, we have biological control tactics, which is the use of predators, parasitoids, and or pathogens to lower pest populations. So we call these our biological control agents, what I like to call our superbugs. So things that are feeding on our pest insects for us, they naturally occur in our landscapes, and they provide that sustainable pest control. So here are some common predators that feed on crapemyrtle bark scale in our landscape. So the first on our left, we have what's called a syrphid fly, also commonly known as a hoverfly or a flower fly. This is the immature stage known as the larva. Look like small green worms, but they are fly larvae, and they are ferocious feeders, typically feeding on all different types of soft-bodied pests. We can see in this photo, it's feeding on a yellow aphid insect, but they're also found feeding on crapemyrtle bark scale. Next, we have ladybird or ladybug beetle adults, and the immature larval stage will feed on the scale. We have lacewing larvae, so an immature stage of lacewings look like little alligators, also ferocious predators feeding on all different types of insect pests. And then we also have found our Florida predatory stink bug. So we have predatory stink bugs that will also feed on this particular insect. So one of the main ones that we've been found munching away on these scale species are these lady beetle larvae from these two genera. Now, based off of their appearance, they may not look like some of our other larval ladybug species that we see in our landscape. They have this cottony, waxy substance on their back. So sometimes, if we're not looking closely enough, they could be mistaken as a pest, maybe potentially a scale insect because of that white, fluffy coating they have on their back. So here are some photos of what this lady beetle larva look like, especially when it's flipped over. They have those distinct legs. Now, how do we tell the difference between crapemyrtle bark scale and our lady beetle larva? So our lady beetle larva, particularly in its later stages, is going to be larger than our scale. They're going to be mobile. As we know with our adult female scales that have that wax coating over their body, they are sessile, they are not moving. Our lady beetle larvae are going to be moving around and feeding on the scale. Their white covering is also going to be much fluffier than the scale covering. As I said, they're going to be moving around pretty quickly, feeding. And on our right, we have a photo showing our scale on our left and our lady beetle larva on our right. Here we have a photo where we're zooming in on a crapemyrtle bark scale ovisac, so an egg sac. And it has begun to hatch. As you can see, if we look closely, all these little pink oval shapes are the crawlers of our scale. as they begun to hatch from the ovisac. But if we look closely, what is this particular insect that we're seeing here? A little unusual. So this is a syrphid fly larva having a feast. So we can see it was inside the ovisac here on our left photo, and on the right, it's starting to emerge as it feeds on those nymphs or those crawlers. So always be out there looking for these biological control agents, these beneficials, these predators, because it's a sign that we have sustainable pest control happening, and they're helping to lower the pest populations for us. Now there's this really great short 2-minute video created by one of our colleagues here at HGIC, Sheena, about finding natural predators of crapemyrtle bark scale. So a great little walkthrough as we look at an actual crepe myrtle that has the scale, and we're pointing out the different predators that you can find. Now going up to the very top of our triangle, our last resort, the most potential risk typically is our chemical controls. So the use of chemicals to prevent, repel, confuse, or kill pests. The most important thing when it comes to chemicals is to read and follow all chemical labels. I don't care if you've used this chemical before, you always want to read the product's label and instructions. They have safety precautions and all the different things you need to know to safely and properly use the pesticide. Home remedies are not recommended. They are not science-based. They are not tested and intended for outdoor use on plants. So this includes things like vinegar, bleach, dish soap. So these could potentially harm the plant we're applying it to and potentially other non-target wildlife nearby. So we do not recommend home remedies or different concoctions. There are potential non-target effects on beneficial animals when we use any sort of chemical. So always weighing the pros and cons and educating ourselves on what chemical products we are using. The most important thing is to look up that active ingredient that is listed on the product label and to read more about it. There's a lot of really great, credible resources like our National Pesticide Information Center, using their resources. You can also use the UMD Extension resources as well. So not all pesticides are created equal. They vary in toxicity, and not all pesticides work on all pests. Now, the ones that are more broad spectrum that can kill any sort of pest has some of the most risk, right? Because they could potentially be harming, say, our pollinators and other beneficial insects. Now we can broadly place our chemicals into these two categories as very general, but we can have our conventional pesticides. These are our synthetics, what we commonly call our insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, and we can also have our biorational pesticides. So relatively, generally non-toxic to people with fewer environmental side effects, typically deemed as lower risk. It's going to really depend and vary based off of the product, of course. So things like our insecticidal soaps, horticultural oils, neem oils, and pyrethrin. So when it comes to biorational pesticides, so things like general public members without a pesticide applicator license, things that people can apply for crepe myrtle bark scale could include things like horticultural oil. Its effectiveness can vary quite a bit. It's not going to have complete control over especially a highly infested plant that has crepe myrtle bark scale, but it could be applied at what we call a dormant rate, so 2 to 3%. It's going to also vary based off the product, so look at the product label itself, to overwintering crepe myrtle bark scale, so typically in the very late fall in the winter time. And then if we're monitoring for our crawlers, maybe we're using our double-sided sticky tape method. We can apply a horticultural oil when we know they're present and active. This is their vulnerable stage before they create that waxy covering over their body that's protective and can be really hard to penetrate with different pesticides, especially our contact ones that need to touch the insect itself. So the vulnerable crawlers is that stage to target with horticultural oil. Next, I do want to bring up conventional pesticides. So these are typically ones that will be used if we hire a pest controller or a landscape professional that has a pesticide applicator license. Now, always checking before we hire someone to apply pesticides that they do have a pesticide applicator's license. It's up to date with the Maryland Department of Agriculture. So this could be an option. We have really heavy infestations and we do want to save the crepe myrtle. So it's a last resort, hiring a professional to apply these pesticides. They may require multiple years of pesticide applications. Mature trees should be evaluated by a certified arborist. And it's important to note that some of the common conventional pesticides that are used for crepe myrtle bark scale are what are known as soil applied neonicotinoids. So neonicotinoids is a class of pesticides that are unfortunately cited as a primary threat to pollinators. So something to be aware of when we are working with a professional and you're going through the different options, that we do our research, we educate ourselves on what products they are using in our own landscapes. So if we want to learn more about the effect of pesticides on pollinators, we do have a really great page on this linked on our bottom left. So that was an overview of some management tactics. Crepe myrtle bark scale can be difficult to control and is going to require multifaceted approaches. So when we're thinking about our triangle there, we could have to pull from multiple sections of our triangle, anywhere from our cultural to our physical to our biological. If you have any further questions about your own situation and any of these control tactics, you can feel free to reach out to us through UMD Ask Extension. So free service, online form, you can submit questions and photos, and we'll get back to you. Here are some linked resources. I am happy to also share this out as a PDF, so you can click directly on the links, but also have them here in the recording. Next, we're going to learn how crepe myrtle bark scale connects to our bigger picture of sustainable landscapes, the importance of boosting native plant diversity, and supporting our beneficial insects. So as we're seeing with crepe myrtles, they've become a very popular plant, especially in our managed, more suburban and urban spaces, because it can be a fairly resilient plant. They also produce these really pretty flowers or blooms. But when we're placing them in these more managed areas where we have lots of hardscapes like sidewalks and roads, maybe we're placing them in a small strip in a parking lot, they're going to face a lot of pressures, such as heat island effect, where we have heat bouncing off the hardscapes and creating pressure and stress on the plant. They could be more prone to pest infestations as well, because we don't have other plants to support our beneficials to help feed on the pests on the plant, so we could result in an outbreak. So we have a little island that we're creating with our one species of crepe myrtle, for instance. We also see, as I mentioned earlier, some unfortunate pruning practices when it comes to our crepe myrtles, known as topping. And some of the research has showed that topping can significantly increase stem decay and branch dieback. So it's important to know what you're doing when it comes to pruning your own crepe myrtles, or if you are hiring someone, making sure they're up to date on the best pruning practices when it comes to our crepe myrtle plants. We do have an article about this linked on our bottom right to learn more about crepe myrtle pruning. Some other research and things that we have found include that when we're applying our broad spectrum pesticides, so these chemicals that can target all different types of pests, in a landscape exclusion experiment, they found that certain broad spectrum insecticides that target beneficial insects could result in an approximate 3-fold increase in crepe myrtle bark scale. So that's huge. So we're spraying this broad spectrum pesticides or applying it in different ways, could be soil applied, for instance. It's ending up targeting our beneficial insects, say our predators like our lady beetle larvae we learned about, killing those off, and then potentially resulting in this pest outbreak or the pest increase, where they found a 3-fold increase in the scale species. Another study that was looking at impervious surface covers, or hardscapes, found that crepe myrtles surrounded by extensive impervious surface cover, so thinking of trees and parking lots, tend to host more aphids relative to trees surrounded by few impervious surfaces, so more of our greenscapes in our plants. So an example to show that we have potentially more pests, we have lots of hardscapes around our plants. Really important to boost that plant diversity. We have two different landscapes on the screen to show the juxtaposition between the plant diversity on our left landscape and the plant diversity on our right landscape. When we add both plant species diversity and structural diversity, what we are doing is creating little microhabitats, microclimates, refuges, and alternate food sources to support all of our different beneficial insects. And thus, in turn, they're going to provide us with sustainable services like pollination for the reproduction of more of our native plants and sustainable pest control. So if we have the option to choose something different, because our crepe myrtles are not native to our area, they can be beautiful, or if we want to add a native plant around our crepe myrtles, here are some options and some alternatives that we can choose from. There are, of course, a lot more different native plants that we can select from. We have our new Maryland native plant program that's being led by our faculty specialist, Lisa Cooter. Definitely check out the Maryland Native Plants Program website that's evolving, has a complete list of different native plants as well as potential certified vendors through the program that is upcoming. It's all about selecting the right plant for the right place. So depending on the space that you're working with sun, soil, and water conditions can depend on what native plant species is right for you. And here are some of my top recommendations when it comes to supporting beneficial insects. So things like reducing or eliminating pesticide use, identifying an insect before considering it a pest, increasing plant diversity, so both that species diversity and structural diversity, having ground covers, native grasses, flowers, trees, shrubs, conserving or creating nesting and overwintering habitat. Approximately 70% of our native bees are ground nesting. They're pretty active this time of year. They are not aggressive and not defensive, commonly mistaken for some of our aggressive ground nesting yellow jackets. So know what you're looking for, support our native ground nesting bees. And then we can provide clean, shallow water sources, especially as we have drier and hotter summers. Our insects need to drink too. And so we can get creative with the pebbles. We can paint them. I like this one where you have a painted bee. So they have a perch they can land on so they don't drown in the water dish. Collect that clean water. Now, when it comes to mitigating mosquito habitat, we want to make sure that we're dumping out that water source at least once a week, even better twice a week. So we're providing clean water once again, and we're also dumping out any potential immature mosquito larvae that could be developing in that water source. Awesome. So we've gotten through our content for today. And as we begin to wrap up today's webinar, I have some individual reflection questions for you to ponder on, such as what happens when a landscape lacks plant diversity? How does this impact natural predators of crepe myrtle bark scale? And how can native plantings help reduce pest outbreaks over time? If you have any thoughts about this, you're welcome to write your comments and your thoughts in the chat box. I'd love to hear what you think, especially as we had our conversations, looked at those different research results when it comes to our impervious surfaces, our hardscapes, and their impact on plants like crepe myrtle bark scale. So with our remaining time, I have this activity that I typically like to do in person, but since we're all joining in virtually, we'll do this individually. You're welcome if you are with a friend or family member to do this together. So the first step is to consider different ways we can engage the public. If we are a Master Gardener volunteer, we are very familiar with this. But if we are not, we can also think about ways that we interact with our neighbors, our neighborhood, our communities, with family and friends when it comes to spreading that science-based information about insects, whether that be beneficial insects or insect pests. So step two, you're welcome to think about this to yourself or to jot it down on a piece of paper, is to brainstorm 3 key outreach elements that you would like to incorporate in maybe a future event or a future conversation that you're going to have with a neighbor. So the first thing, we could use the example of crepe myrtle bark scale as we've learned about that particular insect pest today, but it could be another insect topic. So it could be, say, spotted lanternfly, or maybe we're interested in teaching about a beneficial insect. So the first thing is to educate. What key facts do you want people to know? Something we're thinking about as we begin to develop that conversation piece or that handout or that tabling activity. Second is to engage. How can we make the information interesting and memorable? Maybe it's a pithy or a quick title that we have people to draw in with our display, our table display, or our handout. Maybe it's a really eye-catching photo or image of the insect. And the third is to encourage action. So what's your take-home message? Maybe it's an actionable step that someone can take or a practical solution for, say, a pest like crepe myrtle bark scale. So key facts we want someone to know. How can we make it interesting and memorable, really catch people's attention? And then what is that take-home message? So again, I know we're all virtual. It's a little bit hard to interact with one another, but you're welcome to share your ideas in the comment section below. I encourage you, if you are Master Gardeners, to talk with your fellow Master Gardeners, maybe within your committees, brainstorming some new ideas, especially as we get more questions potentially about this particular pest, crepe myrtle bark scale, or even say our invasive spotted lanternfly. So how can we get that science-based information out there? Some other discussion questions we can think about are what are common misconceptions the public may have about crepe myrtle bark scale? How can that inform different outreach or extension activities that we create? How can we make crepe myrtle bark scale outreach engaging for different audiences, anywhere from, say, our youth to our adults? And what simple sustainable management messages should we emphasize when it comes to crepe myrtle bark scale? Again, we could apply this to any other sort of insect, whether that be a pest or a beneficial. So as you're thinking about this, I just want to thank you all for joining me for this afternoon's webinar. You are always welcome to reach out to me with ideas that you want to bounce off of or co-create. I highly encourage you, if you are a Master Gardener, to reach out to your county coordinators to think through this as well. As we come up to prime tabling season, we have lots of events going on, right? Lots of opportunities to reach the public with this information. And with that, we are potentially ending a little bit early, but lots of time for questions if you have any questions. So feel free to write those in the Q&A. I also have an ending survey, just 4 questions. First 3 are multiple choice. The last one is a free response. I'd really appreciate it if you filled out that survey before you left us today. Provides me some really great information to inform future trainings.
Awesome. Thanks, Maddie. So we can do the couple questions that are in the Q&A while folks take a moment to fill out the brief survey before they exit. Okay, so the first question is, in a neighborhood that has a lot of crepe myrtles, do you need to do anything to avoid getting reinfected from other trees in the neighborhood that might have it? And are these scale moving with the wind?
Yes, great questions. Great questions for sure. Yeah, it's going to be difficult to prevent the spread of, say, the neighborhood managed crepe myrtles onto maybe the ones on your property. They are potentially moving with wind, so the really small crawler, immature stage we found can be picked up by wind and be transported that way. So you are correct on that. That could be a potential mover of our scale species. So I would say what you can control with your own crepe myrtles is boosting and supporting the health of the crepe myrtle plant. So making sure that we're fertilizing properly, we're pruning properly, um, we're not over fertilizing with that nitrogen, and we're monitoring. So being on the lookout for any signs and symptoms of the scale or even potentially the aphid pest developing on our crepe myrtles. And then from there, looking at the different management options that are available.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so the next one is, what do you recommend for really large crepe myrtles that might need chemical usage? They're too
Mhm.
large to apply neem oil, so is there a different chemical that's least harmful? And should you apply via a spray or in the soil?
Great question. I would consult a professional pesticide applicator, again, checking that they do have that up-to-date licensing, and have a conversation with them about the different product options that they have available. And from there, you can reach out to us again, do your own research at the National Pesticide Information Center about the different active ingredients. Like I said, with our neonicotinoids, they are commonly used and they can help to knock down some of these scale populations, especially with heavy infestations in our larger crepe myrtles. But it is about weighing the pros and cons. It can be difficult, especially in those instances that may be our last resort and our last option for saving or preserving that crepe myrtle plant. And there are some best management practices that can be utilized with some of our harsher or more toxic chemicals. So things like making sure we're applying after the bloom period of the plant. So reducing the risk of, say, our pollinators coming into contact with that pesticide. So even with, say, our soil applied pesticides, some can move throughout the plant tissues and go up into the flower and the nectar. So best practice is to wait to apply some of those products until after bloom time, after flowering.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, this is a fun one. Is there anything besides crepe myrtle bark scale and the sooty mold associated with it that can cause tree trunks to turn dark? I know, it's an exciting one.
That is a good question. I'm not a pathologist. I'm sure there could be some other things. The common one is going to be sooty mold that I find. And if you spot what you think is sooty mold, I always like to tell people to look up because it has to be dripping down onto that surface in some way. And so usually the culprit is going to be above that area. And so it can be a little bit hard to spot if we have a really tall tree, for instance. But if you look up, you might see more honeydew and you may even see that sap feeding insect that's causing it.
Awesome. Okay, and then the last question we have in the Q&A, so if you had any questions that you didn't get answered yet, put them in now. But the last question we have for now is when you're talking about clean water, like providing the clean water for insects, someone was asking if using mosquito dunks still counts as clean water.
It can still count from what we currently know. It is very low toxicity for, say, our bees. So that's what it's typically tested against is honeybees and its impact on those. So the dunks that we place for mosquitoes and standing sources of water are specific to flies, different fly groups. So generally safe for other insects. What I would recommend is minimizing its use in, say, ponds, for instance, so more natural areas, those bit dunks, because it could knock down some of our beneficial flies. We're still researching this, but when we're putting it in our bird baths and our water sources for, say, our bees, for instance, it is relatively safe. Yep.
Awesome. What would you recommend for those natural areas instead, like a bubbler or something that kind of moves the water around?
And support having lots of native plants, so aquatic plants to support our dragonfly populations and our other amphibians and predators of insects. So what we've seen quite a bit is if we boost those predator populations, we have fairly low mosquito populations. So our main sources of water that we do need to worry about is kind of those smaller, say in buckets, uh, backed up gutters, for instance. Those are some of our key areas that we want to target, and then supporting all the aquatic predators within our ponds and our more natural areas.
Awesome. Love that. Okay, fantastic. Well, that is the end of our questions. Thank you so much, Maddie. This was really great. We've got some great responses from the poll. Thanks everyone for that. I'm going to go ahead and stop